Yellowstone National Park, Wyoming, July 15, 2019. The morning mist curled over the pines, clinging to the damp stones, as Melissa Lawson stepped onto the Fairy Falls Trail with her 2-year-old son, Noah. In her pocket was a trail register slip, neatly signed, Melissa and Noah Lawson, 8:47 a.m. The sky that day was clear. The hot springs hissed their quiet steam, and somewhere deep in the woods, crows shrieked unseen. No one noticed the small mother and child as they disappeared beyond the bend, and no one knew those footsteps would be the last trace the park would ever have of them. By nightfall, they didn't come back. And then 6 years passed, without a clue, without an answer. Until this morning. The phone in David Lawson's home office rang, shattering the silence that had weighed on him all these years. On the other end, a woman's calm but steely voice. "Mr. Lawson, we found something at Morning Glory Pool. You need to come right away." David slowly placed his hand on the family photo on his desk. Melissa holding Noah, both beaming in the summer sun. His heart pounded. Outside the window, people still walked their dogs, laughed, and chatted as though nothing had happened. But he knew everything had just changed. 6 years after Melissa and Noah Lawson vanished, David Lawson's house was still heavy with silence. Dust clung to the family photos on the wall, where his wife and son smiled so brightly it almost seemed cruel now. The kitchen had long since gone cold. The living room felt hollow. And Noah's bedroom? He hadn't dared step inside since that day. That morning, David sat at his desk, like he always did, forcing himself to stare at meaningless paperwork spread before him. But when the phone rang, everything froze. The caller ID showed a Wyoming area code, strange yet painfully familiar. His chest tightened. The voice on the other end was calm, clipped, metallic. A woman introducing herself as a detective from the Park County Sheriff's Office in Wyoming. She told him he needed to come to Yellowstone as soon as possible. They'd found something at Morning Glory Pool. Hearing the name of that place, David felt the world tilt. Morning Glory Pool, the place Melissa had loved most, a hot spring so dazzling it looked like a rainbow trapped in water. He remembered Noah, barely 2 years old, standing there clutching her hand, wide-eyed at the colors. That was the last time he could picture them clearly. No one came back from that hike. No note, no sign. The detective's voice on the line warned him to prepare himself. What they'd found couldn't be explained over the phone. He'd have to see it himself. He stood too quickly, knocking over his coffee. The dark liquid pooled on the family portrait that had sat on his desk all these years, blurring the edges of Melissa's smile. David stayed frozen for a moment, then finally grabbed his suitcase. 6 years ago, he'd promised himself he would find out what happened. That promise had never left his heart. The flight to Denver felt endless. He didn't sleep, just stared out the window as the Rockies emerged below, shadowy and imposing at sunset. Still beautiful, still majestic, but now they made his chest ache. At the airport, a woman was waiting, the detective. She wore a slate gray suit and carried herself with the cool focus of someone who'd seen far too much loss. She didn't waste words, only nodded and led him to her car. They drove in silence at first. The SUV cut through the winding mountain roads, headlights catching on the dark trees as they passed. Eventually, she told him what the researchers had discovered. They'd been taking mineral samples at the bottom of Morning Glory Pool when their instruments picked up anomalies, metal and fabric, deep below where anyone would expect. They'd called it in immediately, and the scene had been sealed. David kept staring out the window as she spoke, but her last words stuck in his mind. There was nothing in the pool to suggest Noah had been there. And that, she said, raised more questions than it answered. That fragile sliver of hope he'd tried to crush years ago now burned again in his chest, sharp and painful. The SUV climbed higher into the park, flanked by towering cliffs that seemed to close in on him like walls. Every mile brought him closer to whatever was waiting, whether it was closure or another kind of nightmare. He couldn't yet tell. The next morning, Yellowstone felt heavy, though on the surface it was just another summer day. The mist slowly burned off, revealing damp black pines and streams exhaling their ghostly steam. Lines of tourists still trailed along the wooden boardwalks, laughing, taking photos, oblivious to the section of the park that had been cordoned off. David stood outside the restricted area near Morning Glory Pool, where yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the breeze. Beyond it, police, forensic technicians, and university researchers moved briskly around a temporary tent set up by the edge of the hot spring. The pool itself looked as stunning as ever, a giant eye of the forest, swirling in brilliant yellows, greens, and deep cobalt blue. Its beauty was deceptive, cruel even, like it had been waiting all these years to mock him with what lay hidden beneath. For 6 years it had kept Melissa, and maybe something else. Detective Karen McBride met him at the edge to escort him in. She explained as they walked past the tape that the University of Wyoming research team had detected anomalies deep in the sediment, metallic and fibrous traces. When they dredged them up, they found the twisted aluminum frame of a backpack and scraps of faded purple fabric. David recognized the color instantly. Melissa had spent a week researching that backpack, and she'd sewn little reinforcements herself in her favorite shade of purple. Inside the tent, on makeshift wooden tables, the evidence lay neatly bagged: the warped pack frame, the bits of fabric, the partially intact leather soles of hiking boots, all scarred by years of heat and minerals. And then there was the titanium wedding band, still legible, engraved with the words he'd saved up to have etched years ago: "To the summit and back, D&M." David felt his knees weaken as he stared at it. His hands trembled, but he didn't touch it, unwilling to disrupt the chain of evidence. The truth was undeniable now. Melissa had been here. A folder of photographs lay nearby, waiting for him to confirm. He flipped through mechanically, forcing himself to look. These fragments, these pitiful remains, were all that had surfaced after 6 years of silence. But what struck him even harder was what was missing. Nothing belonging to Noah. No tiny shoe, no child's carrier strap, not even a sippy cup or bottle. He asked, though later he wouldn't recall exactly how. McBride gave a faint shake of her head and said that the absence of evidence for Noah might actually mean more than it seemed. For years, everyone had assumed mother and son slipped, fell, and were claimed by the spring. But what they'd recovered today told a very different story. Melissa seemed to have entered the pool fully clothed and geared, something inconsistent with an accident. And more than that, it looked as though she had been placed there. David stepped out of the tent into the morning air, now sharp and bright. The sun was already high, but the chill inside him stayed. He looked at Morning Glory Pool again. It shimmered there, serene and dazzling, as if it had no part in anything dark. For 6 years it had hidden Melissa like a kept secret. And now it left him with another question. If not here, then where was Noah? He closed his eyes and let the heat from the steam brush his face. Deep down, he already knew. This hadn't been an accident, and someone out there knew far more than he did. The morning after the haunting discovery at Morning Glory Pool, David was brought to a nearby ranger station, now serving as an investigation command center. The small meeting room was cluttered with maps stretched across tables, satellite images pinned to corkboards, lists of trails and old logbooks from the summer of 2019. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee, paper, and tension. McBride told him to sit in the corner while she and her team reviewed records. On the table, among the maps, David noticed one marked with a network of shelters, emergency cabins, scattered across the park for hikers to take refuge in during storms. He remembered that day. The weather hadn't stayed fair all afternoon. Around noon, heavy clouds had rolled in, and rain fell hard and fast, rattling through the trees. Melissa had mentioned those shelters before, explaining how they were always stocked with firewood, a stove, a first aid kit, and a logbook to sign in. She'd even marked their locations on her own maps before every hike. Then a man entered the room, gray-haired, in a dark ranger uniform, boots streaked with mud. He had the weathered face and steady bearing of someone who'd spent his life in these woods. He introduced himself as William Harmon, Bill, the ranger who'd been on duty that day, responsible for maintaining the shelters and trails in the area. McBride called him to sit with them, asking him to recall his rounds on July 15th, 2019. Bill nodded like he'd rehearsed it. He recounted his day in precise detail, his voice steady, without hesitation. He'd checked 3 shelters along the Fairy Falls Trail, making sure the locks worked, the firewood was dry, the logbooks intact. He finished his rounds by late afternoon, having noticed nothing out of the ordinary. David listened closely, his eyes fixed on Bill. There was something about the way the man remembered every detail, the exact moment the rain started, which stove he checked, which lock he'd replaced. That unsettled him. After 6 years, the memory was almost too perfect. Bill added that plenty of tourists had rushed for cover from the storm that day, everyone hurrying, no one paying attention to others on the trail. A few names in the shelter logbooks matched witnesses already interviewed. None had reported seeing Melissa and Noah. McBride asked Bill if he still had the original logbooks. He hesitated, then smiled faintly, and admitted he'd kept them all in his own storage. The Park Service had wanted to throw them out years ago, but he'd thought they were worth preserving. McBride immediately sent someone to retrieve them. David stayed silent, watching. When Bill left the room to guide the officer to the storage shed, their eyes met for a split second. And in that instant, David felt a chill crawl down his spine. There was something there. Not quite guilt, not quite remorse, but something buried, hidden. When Bill returned with the old logbooks, David excused himself to get some air. He stepped outside onto the porch, breathing deep the damp scent of pine and wood smoke. The mountains loomed in the distance, still beautiful, still imposing, as if they themselves guarded the secrets of his family. He stared down the trailhead, imagining Melissa clutching Noah, hurrying through the rain, searching for shelter, smiling to keep her little boy calm, even as the thunder roared above them. And then, vanishing, as if they'd never existed at all. David narrowed his eyes, forcing himself to shove the darker thoughts aside. But deep down, he knew, this ranger wasn't just a diligent employee. And maybe, just maybe, this was the man he needed to watch most closely. That afternoon, McBride ordered a full sweep of the Fairy Falls Trail, focusing on the shelters Harmon had mentioned. This time, with forensic techs and a search team, every cabin was opened, photographed, dusted, and examined in a way that hadn't been done properly 6 years earlier. David was assigned to Harmon's group. The ranger seemed oddly at ease, leading them down the trail like a guide who'd done this 1,000 times before. His voice was steady as he described each shelter, how snow drifted here in winter, how the creeks rose dangerously in spring. They passed Beckler Cabin, then Shoshone Lake Cabin, both quiet, empty, nothing left behind but faded names in old logbooks. But when they reached Lone Star Geyser Cabin, the atmosphere changed. This one sat hidden deeper in a grove of old pines far off the main trail. The path was slick with moss, the air colder somehow. When Harmon slipped the key into the lock, David felt his pulse quicken. Inside, the cabin was the same as the others. 4 wooden walls, 2 simple bunk beds, a small wood stove, and a logbook on a dusty table. The light through the grimy window was weak and gray. The forensic team moved in methodically, checking corners, spraying chemicals, dusting surfaces even though no one really expected much after so long. McBride flipped through the logbook, her eyes scanning quickly, and then she stopped. One name stood out, written neatly, Melissa Lawson, 12:34 p.m. The handwriting was unmistakable. The same careful script Melissa had signed on the trail register that morning. David stood frozen as McBride silently pointed to it, then looked at Harmon. The ranger furrowed his brow, feigning surprise, and said the cabin had been empty when he checked it around 2 p.m. that day. McBride gave no reaction, just nodded for the text to photograph the page before moving on. But for David, that answer hit like a stone. Harmon had said he'd finished checking all the shelters by late afternoon. And yet, Melissa had clearly been here. Maybe Noah, too. David's eyes swept the room, scanning for anything. A scratch on the bed frame, a scrap of fabric, something Harmon might have missed. In the corner, where the wall met the floor, there was a faint, dark streak. When a tech ran UV light over it, it glowed faintly in irregular blotches. Then a voice called out, "Found something." Everyone froze. A technician pried a small object from between two floorboards, wrapped in a yellowed tissue, a tiny, dirt-streaked red button. David stepped closer, his heart hammering. It was from Noah's jacket, the little one Melissa had picked out for him for that hike. He swallowed hard and glanced at Harmon. The ranger stood with his arms crossed, eyes cast down, silent. McBride signaled to bag the evidence. The air inside the cabin felt heavier now, thick with the smell of damp wood, chemicals, and suspicion. When they finally stepped outside, David paused on the threshold, taking a long breath. If Melissa had signed the logbook here, if Noah had left a trace, then someone had erased everything else, and whoever had seen them leave this cabin was the last to see them alive. David turned back just in time to catch Harmon watching him before quickly looking away, striding toward the vehicles. This time, David was sure of it. The ranger was hiding something, and he would drag it into the light, no matter what it took. That evening, David sat in his hotel room, staring at the photocopies of evidence spread across the desk. The items pulled from Morning Glory Pool, the printed logbook page from Lone Star Cabin. The pale yellow light buzzed faintly overhead. Sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Melissa's face in the rising steam, Noah's wide, frightened eyes looking back at him, and Harmon, with that steady, unsettling calm. The next morning, McBride showed up unannounced, her expression grave. She told him they'd made an important move overnight, obtaining a warrant to search the employee locker room at the ranger station, where Harmon had once worked. As she drove, her eyes never left the winding mountain road. She spoke in a low voice about how, in her years investigating crimes, she'd learned that some people were very good at hiding their guilt. They left nothing behind at the scene, avoided suspicion, but couldn't help keeping trophies, hidden in places they thought no one would ever look. She believed Harmon was that kind of man. The ranger station's locker room was unremarkable. A narrow corridor lined with battered metal lockers, the air heavy with the smell of pine and sweat. When a maintenance worker cut the lock off number 47, marked as unassigned since Harmon retired, David held his breath. The door creaked open. At first, it looked empty, just a few old ranger coats, a pair of boots, a faded hat. But a forensic tech unscrewed a thin metal panel at the back, revealing a shallow hidden compartment. Inside sat a dark wooden box, thick with dust. McBride slipped on gloves and opened it under the harsh fluorescent light. David's stomach lurched as he saw what lay inside. A delicate silver compass pendant, the anniversary gift he'd given Melissa, engraved with the words, "Find your way home." Her white gold wedding ring, the one she wore when not hiking, still inscribed with their names. A pair of earrings he hadn't seen among the recovered items from the spring. Everything wrapped carefully, hidden deliberately, kept, like trophies from a crime Harmon had quietly admired all these years. David gripped the edge of the locker to keep his hands steady. He looked to McBride and saw the same realization in her eyes that he felt burning in his chest. Harmon hadn't just killed Melissa. He'd planned it, and at least for a while, he'd kept Noah. McBride's voice dropped to a harsh whisper, but every word hit like a hammer. "We're issuing a warrant for Harmon today. If he's still holding Noah, there's still a chance." David closed his eyes, clenching his fists until his knuckles ached. After 6 years, he finally had a name for his nightmare, a face. The man who had taken everything from him, and who, even now, might still be holding his son as a pawn in some twisted game. One promise rose above all others in his mind now, heavier even than the one he'd made 6 years ago. Harmon would not escape. And Noah would come home. That afternoon, the atmosphere at the ranger station was heavy as lead. News of the warrant for Harmon spread quickly among patrol teams and sheriff's deputies in the neighboring counties. His ID photo was pinned to the board, his calm, uniformed face seeming almost to mock them all. He was gone. Since the moment they discovered the locker, Harmon hadn't returned to the station. His personal truck was missing from the lot. His phone was dead. The house where he'd once lived with his wife stood empty. McBride called it the kind of disappearance only someone who's planned for years can pull off. But what chilled David most was her quiet addition. Harmon hadn't left Wyoming. That night, David couldn't stay still at the hotel. He sat in the passenger seat of McBride's SUV, parked a few hundred yards from Harmon's empty house, where a surveillance team kept watch just in case he came back for anything he'd left behind. Inside, the cabin's windows glowed faintly yellow. Outside, the forest was black, the narrow dirt roads dissolving into darkness. A scout's radio crackled with an update. Bank records showed Harmon hadn't withdrawn any money. A neighbor recalled seeing him loading a large crate into his gray pickup a few nights earlier, saying he was heading out for a hunt. And strangest of all, the neighbor noted there was a woman with him. Linda Harmon. David felt a cold weight settle in his chest. He realized for the first time that he'd barely thought of Linda in all these years. She had stayed in the background, quiet, almost invisible, always standing behind Harmon. He'd been so focused on the man himself that he'd overlooked her. But now, the pieces fit differently. She hadn't just known. She'd helped him. McBride opened another file, pushing it across the console to David. Inside were photos, reports, and old paperwork. Linda's file. Their wedding photo. A few shots of her at the school where she'd once worked as a library assistant. And most damning, a forged temporary guardianship document for a child under the name Owen Harmon. Owen. David clenched his fists, feeling his knuckles ache. At dawn, McBride decided to escalate. They'd traced Harmon to an old family hunting cabin, deep in the forest, a property left to him by his grandfather, off the books, but visited regularly. A tactical team was ordered to move quietly at first light. David was allowed to accompany them under close protection. He sat in the back seat of an armored SUV as the convoy crept along muddy tracks, the trees outside rushing past like black cathedral columns. Every turn of the road made his stomach tighten. He didn't know what he would find. He didn't know what Harmon was doing to Noah. He only knew time was no longer on their side. When the vehicles finally stopped at the edge of the forest, the morning fog still clung thick to the ground, obscuring the narrow dirt path that led to the cabin. McBride raised her hand, signaling silence. Shapes in tactical gear, weapons at the ready, fanned out to encircle the house. From a distance, David could just make out the faint glow of a light inside. A shadow moved past the window. Behind the cabin, a gray pickup was parked, blocking a possible exit. He drew a long breath, his fingers gripping the seat so hard they hurt. His heart thudded in his chest. Noah was in there somewhere, and he was about to face the man who had stolen everything from him. The cabin emerged fully from the morning fog, its weathered gray walls standing silent as if they'd witnessed decades of secrets. On the porch, a dim yellow light spilled over muddy footprints. Through the window, David glimpsed movement. One figure, then another. There was no doubt now Harmon and Linda were inside. And if he dared hope, Noah was there too. McBride signaled. Shadows in tactical gear spread out silently, rifles raised, positions locked. Tonight, there was no escape. A single breathless second passed. Only the wind through the pines. Then the loudspeaker crackled, McBride's voice sharp and commanding, cutting through the fog. "William Harmon. This is law enforcement. We have the cabin surrounded. Come out now, hands visible. Don't do anything foolish." Inside, the light wavered. A dark shape darted past the window. A door slammed somewhere deep in the house. No one came out. The team tightened the perimeter. Another minute ticked by, heavy as stone. Then, the cabin door creaked open. A boy stepped out, hair brown, slight frame wrapped in a dark hoodie. He froze at the top step, looking around with wide, lost eyes. David forgot to breathe. Noah. The boy hovered there, glancing back inside as though waiting for someone, then turned toward the blinding headlights and rows of rifles. McBride gestured to a nearby officer, who darted forward, crouched low, murmured something reassuring, and wrapped the boy in his arms, whisking him to safety. It lasted only seconds, but for David it stretched into eternity. Noah was alive, shaken, terrified, unrecognizing, but alive. A gunshot cracked inside the cabin, sharp and shocking, shattering the silence. Everyone ducked instinctively. Red light flared through the window. A flare gun, burning briefly. Linda's scream followed, high and raw, before it cut off. McBride motioned to breach. The door was kicked in. Shouts, boots pounding, the crash of weapons against wood. A guttural groan from somewhere deep inside, like a cornered animal. Then, silence. Moments later, two officers emerged with Harmon, his hands zip-tied behind his back, blood darkening the shoulder of his uniform shirt. His face was pale, but his eyes were the same, cold, defiant. Linda was carried out next on a stretcher, unconscious, her thigh bound in white gauze. David stood motionless as Harmon passed. For a fleeting second, their eyes met. Harmon tipped his head slightly, the corner of his mouth curling into something like a smirk, as though mocking, as though saying, "You'll never understand." McBride placed a steadying hand on David's shoulder, nodding toward the ambulance. She ordered medics to take Noah immediately. David followed, his legs heavy but unwavering. In the back of the ambulance, the boy sat wrapped in a thick blanket, his eyes swollen, gaze downcast, too afraid to look up. David stood in the doorway, watching him silently, taking in every detail. 6 years of searching, 6 years of hell, and now his son was here, in front of him at last. Yet the distance between them still felt as wide as the sky over the park, as deep as the pool where Melissa had been lost. David drew a long, steady breath and thought to himself, "We'll start over, from here." The night faded as the convoy crept out of the forest, headlights cutting through the lingering fog. David sat silently in the back of the ambulance, watching Noah across from him, wrapped in a blanket, hunched over, shoulders trembling slightly. The boy didn't speak. Even when David softly said his name, Noah only glanced up briefly before looking away, as if staring at a stranger. 6 years, more than enough time for a child to forget his father. McBride appeared at the door of the ambulance, her signal brief and businesslike. Harmon and Linda had been transported to the station, booked on charges of murder, kidnapping, forgery, and deliberate concealment. Linda had regained consciousness en route, crying and screaming that everything we did was for our son, thrashing so hard they had to restrain her. Harmon remained silent. His face was blank, his eyes fixed on some distant shadow outside the window, resigned, unrepentant. McBride summarized quietly as she stood beside David. During questioning, Harmon admitted part of what had happened. He'd tried to convince Melissa to give Noah to him, claiming David's family didn't deserve him. When she refused, he lost control. He killed her in the cabin, then carried her body alone to Morning Glory Pool to stage it as an accident. Then he and Linda changed Noah's name, dyed his hair, forged papers, and raised him as their own for 6 years. He didn't regret it. In his mind, he'd given Noah a better life. David sat there, fingers digging into the edge of the bench, his knuckles white. In his mind, all he could see was Melissa, struggling to raise their son, smiling through exhaustion, her eyes always full of hope, all of it erased in an instant by Harmon's madness. The next morning, David sat in the observation room at the sheriff's office. Through the one-way glass, he watched Noah sitting silently beside a social worker and a therapist. The boy was curled up in his blanket, eyes red and distant, avoiding everyone's gaze. McBride came in quietly, taking a seat next to him. She explained that Noah would need time, a long course of therapy to slowly understand the truth. He might never remember those early years, or even recognize David right away. But at least now, he was safe. David nodded faintly, his eyes never leaving the boy. Noah now was just a frightened, confused, lost child. He knew nothing would ever truly be the same. But he wouldn't give up. He stared at his son through the glass, drew a long breath, and told himself, "As long as you're alive, I'll never leave you again. I'll wait, as long as it takes." A week later, the preliminary hearing for Harmon and Linda was held in a small courtroom in Cody, Wyoming. David sat quietly in the back row, watching. Harmon stood tall, his face as calm as if he'd done nothing wrong. Linda sat beside him, her eyes puffy, but her posture rigid, though her hands trembled the entire time. When the prosecutor read the charges, first-degree murder, kidnapping, forgery, obstruction, David didn't look away. As Harmon was led out past the gallery, he glanced sideways at David, his gaze cool and unflinching. This time, David met his eyes and held them, searing the moment into memory. The day justice finally began to reclaim what was lost. The next day, David returned to Denver with Noah. The boy was still quiet, withdrawn, staring out the window for hours at a time. David didn't push him to say, "Dad." He didn't press him for anything. He was just there, waiting, patient, piece by piece. Therapy sessions began slowly. Noah started to open up with the therapist, asking cautious questions. "Where's my mom?" was the first one, and it froze David, who only held his son close without answering. At night, Noah still cried softly sometimes, burying his face in the pillow, calling for the only mother he'd known. But gradually, the nightmares faded. One evening, as David folded laundry in the bedroom, Noah shuffled in, stood there for a moment, then murmured two small words, "Daddy." David turned, his vision blurring, but only crouched down and wrapped his son in his arms. Fall came, and the park was painted gold. David took Noah there every weekend, letting him get used to the outdoors again, to the trails and trees. Noah still preferred to ride on his shoulders, silent, but every now and then a faint smile returned to his lips. One afternoon, they stopped by a small lake, the water glinting with the pale sky above. David stared at the reflection, and in his mind, Melissa appeared, her eyes bright, her smile alive in the sunlight. He lowered his head slightly and whispered to himself, "I brought him home." "You can rest now." Noah looked up at him, curiosity in his eyes. David smiled, squeezed his little hand. The road ahead would still be long, full of sleepless nights, tears, and questions without easy answers. But now they were together again, and that was all that mattered.